investigation of Donald Trump. CBS News has learned that a federal grand jury has voted to indict the former president for his attempt to overturn the results of an election he lost, up to and including his role in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. This is the second time in American history that a president, current or former, has been criminally indicted by the Department of Justice. In both cases, that president is Donald Trump. In June, Trump was indicted in Florida for his alleged mishandling of classified documents after leaving office. Today's indictment is related to efforts by Trump to challenge the results of an election he lost. Up to. CBS News has learned that attorneys for President Trump met with federal prosecutors in the special counsel's office last Thursday. Mr. Trump then posted on his social media not long after that meeting. And he wrote, "My attorneys had a productive meeting with the DOJ this morning, explaining in detail that I did nothing wrong, was advised by many lawyers, and that an indictment of me would only further destroy our country." CBS News correspondent Scott MacFarlane is outside the courthouse where the former president's indictment was just handed up by the grand jury. Scott?
It was at first sealed when it was handed up by this grand jury about 30 minutes ago. Now it's been released. It's a 45-page indictment with 4 felony charges. Let me read them to you, John. Conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. If that phrase, obstruction of an official proceeding, sounds familiar to you, it's because more than 300 of the January 6th riot defendants have faced that charge. The official proceeding being the January 6th electoral count. These are felony charges. Now the second federal criminal case against former President Trump, just released here in federal court in Washington. This is where the case will exist, in Washington, D.C. And based upon the nomenclature of the case number, John, I can tell you this case appears to be assigned to Judge Tanya Chutkin, a 2014 Obama administration appointee who has been noticeably and particularly critical of what happened at the Capitol January 6th and has had some criticisms for the former president when she handles the sentencings of many of the January 6th defendants who've come through her court. So it's 4 charges that do align, John, with what we had from the target letter Donald Trump acknowledged receiving on July 15th. It's that language that indicated obstruction of an official proceeding and conspiracy against rights. We're going to read through the 45 pages of this indictment just released as handed up by a grand jury and its foreperson at 5:15 Eastern Time today, August 1st, 2023.
Scott, we're looking right now at the front page of the indictment. And would you go through for us those 4 counts again, for those of us who are not as well versed in this as you are? And as you say, this tracks essentially what the expectation was. But go through those 4 counts again, if you would.
3 of them have the phrase conspiracy in them, which is somewhat common in a federal case and certainly begs the question, are there more defendants to come? Would it take more than one person to execute a conspiracy? It's conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. Again, there's a very common charge from the Justice Department in January 6 cases overall. Obstruction of, an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. Again, that official proceeding being the January 6th electoral count, which was very much obstructed for several hours that day. And conspiracy against rights, which is a broader term for a charge that goes against people who have power, positions of authority. In some cases, it's police officers facing that charge, or even judges in the past have faced that charge. In this case, it'd be a former president of the United States. There's a lot of granular detail in this indictment we're going to pick up on. But those 4 broad-based counts don't come as a surprise, John, based on what was in the target letter Donald Trump received. There were certain statutes quoted in that target letter that indicated these very charges. But this is an initial indictment of Donald Trump. His first federal case is in the Southern District of Florida. His second federal case right here in the nation's capital in Washington.
And Scott, give us a sense very quickly, if you would, of the drama, if there was any, of this proceeding, or was it otherwise kind of business as usual in the federal courthouse?
This happened in what I would characterize as a garden variety way. The magistrate judge on duty, Mokshila Upadhyay, was handling grand jury returns today, and about 5 p.m. Eastern time, 2 different prosecutors came in. A Department of Justice prosecutor to hand up from a grand jury 2 different charges on 2 unrelated cases, and then an attorney who's been associated with special counsel Jack Smith's case came in and announced the handing up of 1 indictment. The grand jury foreperson in the case was there in the room. They didn't give the initials or the name of the defendant in that case, as is often the case when grand jury indictments are returned. They said they wanted that case sealed. Well, it is now suddenly available and unsealed to the public. A 4-count felony count indictment of the former president. And just one note, logistically here, when you have a federal felony case, it has to come from a grand jury. A prosecutor doesn't do that unilaterally. It comes through the grand jury system, which is why we've been on high alert throughout this day, because the grand jury was seen here early this morning, departed here mid-afternoon, but the grand jury foreperson wasn't seen leaving. So we were expecting some movement in court, and it happened after court closing hours at about 5:15 Eastern.
All right, Scott McFarland, thank you so much with the latest reporting. Robert Costa, your thoughts on these 4 charges?
This is a stunning moment in American history. A former president of the United States has been accused of trying to defraud the United States. And this was, in the words of the special counsel in this indictment, a sprawling conspiracy to overturn a presidential election, not with Trump as some kind of accomplice, but as the person really spearheading the entire operation inside the Oval Office, pulling every lever of power, trying to pressure his vice president to overturn the election. We know former Vice President Mike Pence has been a key witness in this January 6th investigation. Conspiracy to work with someone like John Eastman, the outside conservative lawyer who authored what's called a blueprint for a coup, a 2-page document saying that Trump could falsely argue that there was voter fraud and thus the election needed to be sent back to the states. And why the term defraud the United States? Because the special counsel, based on our reporting, has been interviewing witness after witness saying, did Trump knowingly say he believed the election was rigged, even though he didn't have any evidence to back it up, but he keep pushing this false claim? And they believe they have enough evidence based on all of these witness interviews that they can now say Trump went forward with these false claims constantly in front of the American people, knowing that they were not backed up by facts. Even if Rudy Giuliani was waving affidavits in the air, they didn't have credibility. This is an aggressive move by special counsel Jack Smith, not to paint Trump as someone who was called into some decision by outside lawyers, but Trump as the mastermind of an operation to overturn an election and take American democracy to the brink.
Major Karen.
So the indictment says the former president of the United States spread lies, that he knew that they were lies, and the things that he was saying, not only he had reason to know, but actually knew were false. And to pick up on Bob's point, that makes the former president the central actor in the greatest crisis played out on live television about the peaceful transition of power in our country's history. And the indictment holds him to account. And it's also reflective, we should point out, of criminal referrals made by the January 6th committee. The first 2 referrals it made were obstruction of an official proceeding, and number 2, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Those were the first 2 of the recommendations that came from the House Select Committee on January 6th, and they are reflected in this indictment. And the former president has said, well, I got lots of advice from lawyers. You're the president of the United States. You are the singular person who either can set this in motion or stop it. This indictment and the available record, public and otherwise, indicate and confirm he was the central actor, he set it in motion, and now the law and the facts will try to hold him accountable.
Jeff Begay's Jack Smith will speak at 6 o'clock this evening, we're being told. What do you make of this indictment?
Well, let me first talk about what we're expecting from Jack Smith, if you don't mind. Obviously, we're not expecting a lot. You've seen him before. He doesn't say a lot, barely smiles. That picture is pretty accurate there. But if you look at this indictment, this is built on the backs of the 1,060 people who've been arrested, charged, convicted so far in the nearly 31 months since January 6th. There were a lot of people early on who thought, oh, there's no way they're going to charge a former president. Well, of course, if they believe he is the ringleader. And that's what you see in this indictment. There's a lot of work that has been going into this, not only by the special counsel's office, but also the U.S. attorney here in D.C., who has prosecuted all these people who followed the orders of the former president's supporters, as well as the president himself, come to Washington, D.C. They did. Some of them came armed. And of course, we saw what happened, and 1,000 of those people, and there are going to be more. You know, that investigation hasn't ended. This one hasn't really ended either. There's more to come.
Bob,
There's some breaking news. Trump, the campaign, has responded. This whole indictment now, these series of indictments come in the middle of a presidential campaign. Trump's the Republican frontrunner in the 2024 race, and he is calling this, through his campaign tonight in his statement, election interference. And he's saying the Department of Justice is weaponized. And let me just read you one sentence from the statement from the Trump campaign to understand how the stakes are being laid out by Trump and his allies. The lawlessness of these persecutions of President Trump and his supporters is reminiscent of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the former Soviet Union, and other authoritarian dictatorial regimes. So this is not just a response to a legal proceeding. This is a politically charged and historically dramatic moment with real gravity for what this country can endure in terms of American democracy when something's being compared by the Republican frontrunner to something that occurred in Nazi Germany, all while the investigation, as Jeff said, continues apace.
The former president has cornered the political market on florid language, especially when he's in duress. But that doesn't make it legitimate, and it doesn't make it true. To call something election interference when you are being held to the legal account of this country for interfering in the peaceful transfer of power is not only ironic, it is a form of psychological projection. The former president of the United States clearly, if you read this indictment, and available to everyone who watched live television on January 6, 2021, set in motion an effort to slow down, if not interfere or block, a congressional proceeding to certify that presidential election. That happened. To hold him and anyone associated with him to account legally for all time in our nation's history is not the act of an authoritarian regime.
Scott McFarland has the latest on when former President Trump will show up. Scott?
Our latest reporting, John, is that Donald Trump will make an appearance here at the federal courthouse in Washington, 4 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. In short order, 48 hours after he's charged, he'll make his appearance here in Washington, D.C. This courthouse is massive. It's like the size of a small college basketball arena, 6 floors, dozens of courtrooms, many judges. His appearance will be before the same magistrate judge to whom this indictment was handed up today, Judge Mokshila Obadiah. She's the magistrate judge who handles initial appearances. In some cases, she handles arraignments. That's where Donald Trump will appear. If it's in her courtroom, it's the 2nd floor, courtroom 5 of this federal courthouse, but any number of security protocols will likely go into place, just like they did in Manhattan when the former president appeared there for court, just like they did in Miami when the former president appeared there for court. There are 3 entrances to this courthouse. It's a giant, and likely some of the areas here will be closed off for what is typically in the federal system a short initial appearance, measured in minutes. Not a lengthy procedure, but nevertheless an historic procedure, with Donald Trump appearing here in 2 days.
Scott McFarland, thank you. Bob, quickly.
So as we read over this indictment of Trump, it's very important to note, as our colleague Graham Cates has noted in his reporting, that there are multiple co-conspirators listed on pages 3 and 4 of the indictment. And it's suggestive of people who are working with Trump, an attorney who willingly spread knowingly false claims to pursue strategies related to Vice President Pence's ceremonial role overseeing the certification, a political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit false fraudulent slates. So what you see from this document, and if you carefully read it, page 3 and 4 and other pages here, is that this was an operation alleged by the special counsel to have taken place on multiple fronts. Trump pushing people in the states, in the state legislatures at the Republican state level, to try to send back alternative slates and to have activists act as so-called fake electors. At the same time, he wanted members of Congress to overturn the election on January 6, 2021. At the same time, he wanted the Justice Department to give their imprimatur and to say that the election was in some way corrupted by election false election action by people on the ground. And he wanted the vice president to be involved. So you really see the special counsel detailing everything and calling it a co-conspirator at work.
6 unindicted co-conspirators in the indictment.
Whose names we don't know yet.
We do not know yet.
Let's bring in Ricky Kleeman, CBS News legal analyst. Ricky, the special prosecutor says that the former president, shortly after the election of November 3rd, 2020, the defendant launched his criminal scheme. I'd like your take on what that means, but one more item from the indictment. It states that Trump widely disseminated his false claims of election fraud for months, despite the fact that he knew and in many cases was informed directly that they were not true. What's your thought about a criminal scheme and what you've been able to tell so far from this indictment?
Well, of a 145-page indictment, John, we're looking at, out of a 45-page indictment, we're looking at 130 paragraphs, which detail facts that create the elements of criminal offenses. There may be a political overlay here, and we can talk about the political overlay at another time. But right now, what we have in front of us is something that is a document that charges a person with criminal offenses that create prison time, and it is the result of a painstaking investigation. When we hear the word conspiracy, what also ought to come to mind is the timing. We are now on August 1st. We have a case that is supposed to come to indictment because the prosecutor has said so in Georgia. And Fani Willis, that prosecutor, has talked about the possibility of looking at a criminal scheme, same words, but as a RICO conspiracy, a racketeering influence, organized, corrupt conspiracy. One of the reasons that I believe Jack Smith finished up and got this out now was he needs his indictment to be first so that any indictment in Georgia does not try to supersede or contradict the Department of Justice indictment. And what's important to me here, John, is who are the victims. Not only all those Congress people and the people who were working in Congress on January 6th during that terrible day, but also it's the voters. It's the civil rights violation. Whose rights were abrogated? It's the voters, in the sense that their votes were going to try to be taken away by a scheme that had gone on for months to say that those votes in those 7 states should be flipped. And that's what stands out to me.
Ricky Kleeman, thank you very much. With us now is Scott Frederickson, a former federal prosecutor. Scott, pick up wherever you would like, but also would you address this notion that the former president mentioned in one of his social media posts? He said he was told by lawyers. Bob Costa has been reporting that may be one of the prongs of his defense, which is, I was just following the wise legal counsel of those around me. Major also addressed this. How much of a shield is that in this case?
Well, I think the indictment meets that head on. 5 of the unindicted co-conspirators are attorneys, his own attorneys, except for one who was a Justice Department attorney. There is a advice of counsel defense, but you don't have an advice of counsel defense when your own attorneys are your co-conspirators. If you assert an advice of counsel, you waive that privilege, and that means the prosecutors get to look at all those communications. An attorney cannot advise you to commit a crime, and you can't rely on that as a defense. So early on in the indictment, Special Counsel Smith lists 6 unindicted co-conspirators. 5 of those are attorneys. 4 of those are Trump's own attorneys. So, he's entitled to a fair trial, but frankly, that kind of blasts any idea of advice of counsel right out of the water.
All right, Scott Frederickson, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
There's a couple other things that I think we should note. Right out of the box, the special counsel makes clear that his case is based on the premise that this was a president who was determined to stay in power and to do it by spreading lies about the false election, lies about the lies about it being stolen. The other thing that we were waiting to see is whether, as part of the conspiracy, the special counsel would bring in the January 6th riot and insurrection, and he did. Part of the manner and means of the conspiracy as alleged in the indictment is that when it became apparent the Vice President Pence, would not agree to stop his electoral college counting, which confirmed the election of President Biden, the former president encouraged a violent crowd to go to the Capitol, and they attempted to exploit that. So we didn't know if that was coming as well. The rest of it is incendiary, but as expected, use of false state electors, false certificates, the rendition of all the facts showing the president was told over and over again by a variety of people that his lie about the election being stolen was in fact false and was a lie, and he knew it. So all of that's laid out in this indictment in fairly clear form.
Scott Frederickson, former federal prosecutor, thank you so much. We now have Democratic Congressman and former January 6th committee member Jamie Raskin joins us now. Congressman, this was obviously something, a recommendation was made by the January 6th committee. How does this indictment square with what the committee wanted, and how much further does it go?
Well, it's parallel to what we suggested, and I think it's a very elegant sequencing of what took place, because there was a conspiracy to interfere with the federal proceeding, the joint session of Congress, to receive and count the electoral votes. There was a conspiracy to defraud the American people by assembling all of these counterfeit electors and then presenting them as a justification for setting aside the lawful constitutional proceeding and moving in a different direction, just to name Donald Trump essentially the new president. And then all of it was galvanized for the purpose of conspiring to substitute this phony result for the actual voting rights of the people. And that count, to me, is an echo of what Abraham Lincoln said about insurrection back at the beginning of the Civil War, where he said that violent insurrection is fundamentally an assault on the rights of the people to choose their own leaders. And that's essentially what this indictment is saying in the form of a criminal prosecution. This was an effort to steal away the actual lawful election result and the voting rights of the people by substituting a completely counterfeit and fraudulent process.
Congressman, you and the committee were unable to speak to some people within the Trump inner circle, former Chief of Staff Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, the Vice President, Mike Pence. I don't know if you have had a chance to read through all of this, but even if you haven't, what would you be looking for to see whether the special counsel's investigative skills built upon the case that you laid out in those hearings? Or have you seen anything in what you've been able to read that suggests that he was able to make the case more thoroughly in some of these areas that you all were investigating on the committee?
Well, I've only been able to give it a cursory read, but it's quite parallel to what the committee found. Of course, we included one statutory charge that appears to be omitted here, which is aiding and abetting and giving comfort to an insurrection. And of course, we don't know why either the grand jury decided not to vote a charge there, or Jack Smith decided not to bring that charge before the grand jury. It is a statute that has not been used very much, and it's one that has not been constitutionally tested in the Supreme Court. So maybe they decided there is such a superabundance of other criminal violations that are evident that there was no reason to go to that one. But otherwise, they found pretty much as we found. This was an attempt to overthrow the election result, to usurp the voting rights of the people, to interfere with a federal proceeding, and to establish a counterfeit electoral process to supplant the actual one that exists under the Constitution and under federal and state law. So I feel very pleased that this is such a vindication of the rule of law in America, and that this grand jury saw what the January 6th committee saw when we tried to analyze the chaos and the violence that had been unleashed against America, not just on January 6th, but in the weeks leading up to it.
All right, Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you so much for being with us. We are waiting for the special counsel to go to those microphones you're looking at. He's scheduled for 6 o'clock, and we'll go to him the minute he utters his first syllable. Until then, congressional correspondent Nicole Killian is outside of the Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta. Nicole, remind us why you're there, and has there been any reaction down in Atlanta to this indictment?
Yeah, well, certainly this is on the radar of Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. In fact, we heard from the Fulton County Sheriff earlier today who spoke to reporters who echoed what we've heard from the district attorney here, is that they are ready to go in terms of their own case that they have been pursuing in regards to alleged 2020 election interference. And the sheriff noted that it is even possible that he could send a team to Washington to observe in the event that the former president is arraigned and makes a court appearance in Washington, D.C. That is something that they did not only in Miami when the former president appeared there, but also in New York to prepare, because we are currently in a window where the district attorney at any time could announce a charging decision in her investigation, which has spanned for more than 2 years. And of course, the centerpiece of that investigation is a phone call that was made to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in the days right before January 6th, where the former president pressed Raffensperger saying, find me the 11,760 votes in an attempt or hope to perhaps overturn the election results here in the state of Georgia. We know that the Secretary of State not only appeared before a special purpose grand jury here in Fulton County, but also met with federal prosecutors. And that call is also cited in the indictment that was unsealed today. So while there is some overlap with these cases, of course, they are quite different in nature and scope as well. But we do expect a potential indictment here in Fulton County within a matter of weeks, John.
Nicole Killian, congressional correspondent in Fulton County, on just one of the portions of what the special counsel has called a criminal scheme by the former president that he alleges was launched just after Election Day on November 3rd, 2020. As far as the current sitting president is concerned, Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is with President Biden. Nancy?
John, we're in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where President Biden is on vacation, keeping a low profile. We have asked the White House for any reaction to this indictment, but we don't expect to get one, frankly. This White House repeatedly, when asked about indictments, when asked about charges against the former president, when asked anything about these ongoing investigations, tends to say nothing, or as little as possible, referring us to the Department of Justice. Everyone at the White House, from the president on down, has said that they don't want to influence DOJ in any way. But that doesn't mean that President Biden hasn't weighed in on his predecessor's actions, especially when it comes to January 6th. He doesn't talk about it very often, but when he has been scathing, John. On the one-year anniversary of January 6th, he accused former President Trump of rallying the mob to attack. He said he watched it all on TV from the White House dining room near the Oval Office and did nothing for hours as police were assaulted. He accused him of spreading a web of lies, not just on January 6th, but months before the election even took place. And he said that the former president ignored what he was being told by his own attorney general, his own vice president, and governors from every state in the nation about the validity of the 2020 election. We don't hear much from this president anymore, particularly not as this investigation heated up about his predecessor's actions. He has tried to be very careful, knowing that this is going to be an ongoing issue as we get closer to his repeat matchup, if you will, against former President Trump.
Nancy Cordes with President Biden, White House correspondent. Thank you so much, Nancy. Scott MacFarlane has some more details as we wait for the special counsel to walk to the microphones. Scott, what do you know about the judge?
If you go to the last quarter of the indictment, you see references to January 6th. A lot of talk about fake electors, a lot of talk about what was known about the election. But if you get to the bottom quarter, you see references to what the special counsel calls the defendant's exploitation of the violence and the chaos at the Capitol. And one of the references is to then House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy in a conversation Donald Trump had during the riot with Kevin McCarthy, in which there was a reference, according to the special counsel, that you seem more concerned about the election than they seem more concerned about the election than you do, Mr. McCarthy. But also, note where this case is headed. It's headed here to Washington, D.C., to federal court, and assigned to Judge Tanya Chutkin, a 2014 appointee of this court, an Obama administration appointee who will be handling this case after the magistrate judge has her hearing with Donald Trump on Thursday.
Scott, briefly, and I might have to leave you because the special counsel's due any moment, but what's security like there, and how, I imagine when the former president shows up, it's going to be quite severe.
A lot of reinforcements here. The U.S. Marshals are here. U.S. Park Police and D.C. Police all have some type of foothold at this courthouse when there's major events. We expect that to ratchet up exponentially Thursday afternoon for this 4 p.m. Eastern Time court appearance.
Scott McFarland, thank you. Just quickly, Jeff Pegues, the security, you've covered this now for this is the third one. Each time, significant measures have to be taken.
Yeah, and we didn't really see that in Miami. You saw the court appearance there. There weren't enough barricades was the concern. Miami police thought they did a good enough job. But in Washington, D.C., because of all of the landmarks here, because of all the public activity on the streets any given day, you're going to have to set up a lot of barricades. You're going to have to coordinate between federal and local law enforcement. And of course, on January 6th, there was criticism about how well or how intelligence and law enforcement efforts sort of fell apart leading up to January 6th. And so they're not going to want a repeat of that. Sure. They're going to make sure that they coordinate with D.C. Homeland Security to prepare.
And visually, it will be an echo, in a sense, if the former president's supporters arrive, as they did in Miami and as they did in Manhattan, it will echo the scenes of that very day.
Yeah, but the crowds have not been that big. Yeah. Why? Because a lot of people are facing criminal charges for following President Trump's orders and showing up here in Washington.
Certainly smaller numbers than the former president had hoped or led people to believe there might be on his behalf. One of the things that the indictment makes very clear, and it's an important point in this moment in American history, the indictment makes clear something that is fundamentally true but needs to be stated in a legal document like this. The defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and to even claim falsely that there had been outcome-determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the result of the election. I'm reading from the indictment directly. It also says, after exhausting all of those legitimate legal means and being shown that he lost, the president then became malicious about holding on to power. And the idea that he can speak about this, raise questions, pursue legal avenues, all of that is legitimate. And he did that. But once he lost there, he made a fundamental decision, one never before made by any sitting chief executive in the history of this country, to take other means to hold on to power. And that is the central question in this indictment and will be the central question before the jury.
There are rules for fighting these things out. He didn't play by them.
No.
And we build on what Major just said. It's such an important point. December 30th, 2020, Donald Trump has a conversation, then president, with Steve Bannon. Pence is on vacation as vice president. He says, get Pence home. Pence is now the target. Because as Major said, everything had failed for Trump and Giuliani in the courts. They were struggling to have any kind of strategy moving ahead. The electors had already voted in mid-December of 2020. December 30th, a turning point. Focus on Pence. That's what Bannon and other outside advisors tell Trump. And on January 3rd, Pence goes to the Senate parliamentarian, and she tells him, sir, you have nothing to do with on January 6th except count the votes. He says, well, that's what my lawyers have been telling me. That's what I'm going to do. The next day, January 4th, 2021, John Eastman, the conservative lawyer who authors this blueprint for a coup, in the Oval with Pence. And Trump confronts Pence face-to-face in front of Eastman and other lawyers, and he says to Pence, listen to John. Almost threatening, based on our reporting. Listen to John. Follow the Eastman plan. Pence says, I'll still think about it. Let me take my time, but I can't do it, Mr. President. The next day, Trump calls in on January 5th, Pence into the Oval Office for the ultimate one-on-one with Trump. Trump is so into the moment and this has been confirmed by testimony in front of the January 6th committee, he opens the door to the Oval Office so he can hear the gathering mob outside on Freedom Plaza. A freezing cold night. Some of the aides to Trump walk in the Oval Office and they say to themselves, why is the door open? Gusts of air are coming in the room. But Trump wants to hear the mob outside, and he says to Pence, infamously, based on our reporting, you have to do this for me, Mike. You have to do this for me. Walk away from the certification on January 6th, because what was the hope? That the certification would be delayed. And if it was delayed, then the conspiracy would be effective in Trump's eyes, because the states where at least Republicans controlled the legislatures could send new electoral slates.
And Major, this is not just a question about the past. What you were talking about is there is a system for adjudicating disputes in America, and the president did not play by that system. And we're coming up with another election, and there are many people who thought it wasn't that he played outside the rules, it was that he didn't play hard enough outside the rules.
Well, there might be some who believe that. He could have played harder. I don't know quite how he could have played any harder. As Bob has articulated, he tried to use the Justice Department. He tried to use the Department of Homeland Security. He tried to use his political apparatus. He tried to convince state legislatures. I mean, just about every lever he could think of to pull, he tried to pull. And we have an established record on this. These are not disputable facts. They aren't. And the testimony that makes them indisputable facts comes from not Democrats who hate former President Trump, not think tank people who are not aligned with the Republican Party stalwarts, Trump administration stalwarts, people handpicked by the former president. They are the central and most important witnesses in this case, and they will be as this case unfolds. We've had close elections in our history, John. You know this as well as I do. 1800, 1824, 1876, 1960, 2000. And every single one of those close elections in which the fate of the country was in the balance for those who were most aggressively competing for that power, all of them had a central choice to make. Do I try to undermine this system, or do I live within its guardrails? Every single previous president lived within those guardrails until this one.
And one thing we have not mentioned, as a result of January 6th, 5 police officers died. I mean, think about those pictures. I will never forget the picture of the guy beating on the officer with an American flagpole. To me, that said it all. This was a mob attacking these police officers, and too often, I think, and I'm sure the families of the officers feel the same way, they get lost in all this. But that was a violent day.
Bob, Greg Jacob, lawyer for the vice president, as I recall, there's this question of whether the president was just listening to his lawyers. There was some testimony in the January 6th hearings, as I recall, that from Greg Jacob, that the president was told by John Eastman that this was not a legal theory, that this idea of fake electors was not legal, and that goes to this question.
You're basically asking Pence for a small violation of election law. That's a direct quote from the January 6th investigation.
There he is in that testimony, which suggested that, which undermines this idea that the president
that it was foundational, that it was legitimate, that it was the body of understood law in America. It wasn't the body of understood law by any stretch of the imagination.
And what you see from John Eastman is someone who comes out of the orbit, who's not part of Trump's inner circle. But in the final days of the Trump administration, he's looking for anyone who's going to give him an exit ramp, a path to stay in power. That's why Sidney Powell is in the White House. She's up in the residence of the White House talking with Trump about potentially seizing voting machines. And that's why John Eastman, who was not known by Trump, a lawyer from California, is brought in because he says, well, there might be a way. But you're right, Greg Jacob, the counsel for then Vice President Pence, in that January 4th meeting, Pence says to Eastman, why don't you just go meet with my lawyer, Greg Jacob, and hash it out? And so they have a private meeting in the old executive office building, John Eastman and Greg Jacob. And in that meeting, based on under oath testimony from Greg Jacob before the January 6th committee, Eastman reportedly says, well, I did float this theory to Trump, and I have authored this memo, but I'm not really sure it's going to hold water. And Jacob explodes. In fact, he's a mild-mannered person, but he explodes in terms of being a lawyer, saying, how is this circulating at the highest levels of the federal government? Yet Eastman persisted, because even on January 6th, when the Capitol is under siege, Jacob talks about how he's communicating with Eastman via text messages and email, and Eastman saying, follow the plan, follow the plan.
And Major, this is something the former president still believes now. All of these things, he hasn't changed his mind on the legality of it, and the outcome of the election, as wrong as they both may be.
No, he hasn't. As a matter of fact, he's even waded into the possibility of becoming president again and issuing pardons for anyone implicated in this. So that puts in a nutshell his approach to the facts, to the law, and to power. If he reclaims it, he will pardon those who helped put this in motion.
Jeff Pegues, we got about a minute, apparently, until Jack Smith shows up. He doesn't say a whole lot when he comes out.
No, he doesn't. As you guys know, I sort of bumped into him on a plane to Miami, and I was just watching his mannerisms just to see if he would crack a smile with his team, maybe drink something. I didn't see anything like that. He seemed focused, even sitting. I think he was sitting in a middle seat, may have been a window seat, but sort of blended in. Most people on the plane, I don't think they knew who he was. And he wasn't trying to draw attention, but we just spotted him.
And what do we...
Part of history now.
Yeah. I think
indelibly.
He's done, I think, 100 triathlons, so I think he has the fortitude to make it through a middle seat. What do we know about his operation? It's been pretty unleaky, just as these kinds of investigations go. Does it have a character to it?
Jack Smith's character. The prosecutors that he has on that team, they are among the best. They are pros, they are major league prosecutors. And you see that because there really aren't a lot of leaks coming out of that office. People will say, oh, there really aren't that many leaks. They do their speaking through these court documents, and that's why these court documents are so detailed, because in a lot of ways they're trying to respond to what the former president puts out on social media.
Well, and that raises the question as we watch, perhaps here we have the special counsel entering the room now. And let's pause to listen to Jack Smith as he addresses reporters.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens here in the District of Columbia, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6th, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots, and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. I would like to thank the members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on this investigation with my office, as well as the many career prosecutors and law enforcement agents from around the country who have worked on previous January 6th investigations. These women and men are public servants of the very highest order, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. Thank you.
Why didn't you charge any of the other co-conspirators in this
And there we have Special Prosecutor Jack Smith saying this is an unprecedented act, an attack on the bedrock function of democracy. He was typically laconic. Bob Costa.
One thing to note that the special counsel did not is former Vice President Mike Pence, based on this document, is a central, crucial, key witness in this investigation. This indictment says Pence took contemporaneous notes, and date after date of Pence's recollection of events is there. We know Pence met for hours with the grand jury, but to have a former vice president who was in the room with Trump, often one-on-one in the Oval Office, and now testifying in detail to the special counsel, he could end up being the most important witness in this case.
Because do you think, Bob, it's not just X happened after Y, but he has some ability to speak to what was inside the former president's
And he can
head.
speak to possible criminal intent. Now, Pence has said publicly he does not know, and it's not for him to judge whether Trump had criminal intent in his actions. But by Pence detailing what Trump said, for example, this indictment says Pence recalled Trump calling him not too honest, as they had a private conversation about the election. And so Pence is someone who was weaponized at the end of the presidency for Trump. And to have him cooperating with the investigation gives the special counsel an eyewitness account that someone who's not a lawyer or some Trump functionary.
And to put this in a political context, let's also remind ourselves that the former vice president is now challenging the former president for the nomination of the Republican Party in 2024. So he is a witness against the former president, as Bob Costa just outlined, and is a political opponent against him. And he is a primary fact witness and a constitutional empowered officer of the executive branch. And that makes him the most important, or if not the most important, one of the most important fact witnesses, because he saw this entire progression of the argument through all of the ways that Trump was thwarted through the legal means of challenging the election. Then he went to extra legal means, and he was the recipient of maximum pressure on that extra, according to the indictment, extrajudicial pressure to overturn the election.
But go ahead. Here's the thing. You know, a lot of this obviously, allegedly, happened behind closed doors. But what's so frustrating sometimes about the former president is that he'll say things publicly where a prosecutor or even his own attorney would be flabbergasted, just telling him, please stop, don't keep putting this information out there. So a lot of what is in this happened publicly.
We're going to turn now to Scott Frederickson, a former federal prosecutor. Scott, what's your take after taking a look at this and listening to the special prosecutor in his remarks?
Yes, I think one thing that strikes anyone who has watched Special Counsel Smith is that he does not show emotion very often. He showed emotion today when he talked about the fact that this indictment is brought consistent with the prosecutions of the individuals responsible for the deaths of 5 law enforcement officers and the violent mob that attacked the Capitol. And when he talked about that here at his brief news conference, you could see he was emotional about that, and that is driving him when he said this was an assault on democracy fueled by lies of a president.
And just to underscore that, Scott, so the point is that while in the political realm this might get discussed in all kinds of maybe even abstract ways or in political terms, what it sounds like he was doing is saying 2 bedrock principles: accountability and also that there were real victims here who held the line when somebody else was trying to cross it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what surprised most of us here is how much of the January 6th events have been made a part of this indictment. Many thought that he would avoid that and the incitement of the violent mob coming up the Capitol. Instead, it's a central part of the indictment, especially when he gets into the detailed rendition of the attempts to change the vice president's mind in almost a Shakespearean mano face-off, but detailing falsehoods over and over again told by the former President Trump in an attempt to change the vice president's mind.
Former federal prosecutor Scott Frederickson, thank you. Ricky Kleeman, our CBS News legal analyst, is with us now. Ricky, you've taken a a longer look at this indictment. What else have you concluded? We're going to go back to Ricky in a second. Bob Costa, you know the players so well in this drama. Sticking with your idea, your point about the president being the central actor here, if Mike Pence is another key person, who else are you looking for as a useful witness for some of what we don't know or what the special prosecutor may have come up with in this indictment?
So I'll always remember the night of January 5th. I was outside the Willard Hotel. And while Trump had a hotel for most of the time he was president of the United States in Washington, down on Pennsylvania Avenue, the other Trump hotel on the eve of the insurrection was the historic Willard Hotel. Because inside that hotel on January 5th, Rudy Giuliani, Steve Bannon, and so many of their associates were calling Republicans in Congress. They were pressuring them to do Trump's bidding. They infamously issued a statement saying Pence was in agreement with Trump's position on January 6th, even when he was not, causing Pence to erupt along with his aides and say that's false. And so you have the Willard under the microscope now. Everyone who was inside the Willard plotting with Giuliani and Boris Epstein and all of these other associates to try to overturn the election, and those outside who were intense, getting ready for the rally the next day and to attack the Capitol, and then, of course, across the street at the White House talking to Trump late into the night. All of these people are now in the spotlight based on this indictment of the special counsel. He is not just painting this, based on this indictment, as something that was a bit of a bad idea gone wrong. He is saying that there was criminal intent to deceive the American people, to defraud the United States, and to mount a multi-pronged conspiracy. It's hard to digest that this is being alleged to happen, and it's being done by the Justice Department at the highest levels against the Republican frontrunner.
Right, indeed.
And the indictment pays the former president a compliment, indirectly, in the sense that his vocalizing falsehoods about the election had a dramatic, galvanizing, and impassioning effect on much of the country. Reading from page 2, to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. The indictment says the former president achieved all of that just by the sound of his voice, conferring upon him one of the things that former President Trump likes to say about himself. He has a movement, he has a voice, and people respond to it. All true, former President Trump, but you use that voice, you use that influence in ways that are now putting you in criminal danger.
Knowingly used it to advance a criminal scheme. Ricky Kleeman is apparently back on the line. Ricky, you've taken a further look at this indictment. What do you come up with?
When I look back, John, at my prosecutorial days, what I wanted to know were who are the victims, what did they suffer, and how did they suffer? Well, the major victim here, of course, is democracy. The secondary, or perhaps in tandem victim, are the American people. The third victim are the American voters. All of those go together. But when we look at the individual paragraphs, what we have to remember, in addition to the people in Congress who might have suffered serious bodily harm, injury, and even death, what we have to also look at is Mike Pence as a central victim in this indictment, and that Mike Pence became a person that Donald Trump, according to the indictment, wanted to do his bidding, and that was to change the election result, that Mike was supposed to do the quote-unquote right thing. But when he didn't, at the time that the Capitol is being breached, that Donald Trump's tweet, when he goes and says that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country, et cetera, which is in paragraph 111, that is what spurs on the chance of hanging Mike Pence. And if Mike Pence had not been spirited away by his Secret Service, he might not be running for the nomination today.
CBS legal analyst Ricky Kleeman, thank you so much. Ricky, now we want to go to Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes, who has a thought. Nancy?
John, it was notable in that brief statement that we just heard from the special counsel, Jack Smith. One of the things he did say was that he's going to be seeking a speedy trial. That's notable because we know that he's not getting a speedy trial in the case in Florida having to do with former President Trump's handling of classified documents. That case is not going to go to trial until at least mid-2024, just a few months before the presidential election. If he were to get a speedy trial in this case, let's say early 2024, then the trial could take place and we could have an outcome well before the 2024 election takes place in November, possibly even before the end of primary season. And that's notable, of course, because President Trump is currently the runaway frontrunner, according to recent polls. And actually, his lead appears to be growing all the time. This is something that the Biden campaign is obviously watching very closely because they are anticipating a matchup again against former President Trump. But when we asked the Biden campaign whether they had any reaction to this new indictment, they said, as predicted, no comment.
Nancy Cordes, thank you, Nancy. Scott Frederickson, I want to bring you back in on something that Nancy hinted at, the calendar. But let's forget the political calendar for the second. How does whoever is in charge here operate all these different investigations and indictments and court trials all at the same time? There are the president's indicted 3 times, plus there are several civil cases. How does all that get coordinated?
Well, it's a good question. There's no formula. It's not provided for in any federal rule, let alone any state rule. Oftentimes, it's the first case indicted, and they take it in turn. But I think what's interesting here is that this case, which will come to the arraignment for the former president on Thursday, this case could actually jump ahead of the Mar-a-Lago documents case for one important reason. There are no classified documents involved in this case, and the classified documents are a serious complexity in the Mar-a-Lago scheduling. It takes a lot of time to work through those issues. There are none of that issues here. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if this judge, the new judge here in Washington, took this case and moved it ahead and moved it into early 2023 ahead of the Mar-a-Lago case. Of course, the former president will fight that and want to delay it till after the trial. But I think the judge could also make a point that this is the most important case. This is the one indictment that charges criminal conduct while the president was in fact in office as the president, unlike the other cases. So it goes to the heart of kind of the most important charges against him. So I could see this case getting moved forward in an earlier time spot.
All right, Scott Frederickson, thank you for that analysis of the calendar. Once again, former President Trump has been indicted by the special counsel on 4 counts tied to his attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. Among the charges include conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruction of an official proceeding. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. For all of us here in Washington, I'm John Dickerson.
Hello, I'm Weijia Jiang in Washington. A federal grand jury has voted to indict former President Trump in the January 6th investigation. He faces 4 counts in the indictment, including conspiracy to defraud the United States. The former president has been summoned to the courthouse here in Washington on Thursday. There are at least 6 co-conspirators that are not named. Special counsel Jack Smith had this to say about the indictment.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens here in the District of Columbia and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy. As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots, and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. I would like to thank the members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who are working on this investigation with my office, as well as the many career prosecutors and law enforcement agents from around the country who have worked on previous January 6th investigations. These women and men are public servants of the very highest order, and it is a privilege to work alongside them. Thank you.
Why didn't you charge any of the other?
For more on this, Graham Cates and Jessica Levinson join us now. Graham is a CBS News investigative reporter, and Jessica is a CBS News legal contributor. Jessica, I want to start with you. I know that you've probably been leafing through these 45 pages along with the rest of us. What did these counts tell you about the potential evidence that Jack Smith has now collected against Donald Trump?
It tells me that it's strong and that there is a lot of it. So what we see here in the 4 counts is really a methodically laid out indictment that talks about a scheme to defraud the United States, to try and stop the counting of the Electoral College votes, and to try and cheat people essentially out of an honest counting of their vote. I think it's interesting here that the special prosecutor did not decide to go ahead with the insurrection claim, because that can be difficult to prove, and there can be some First Amendment issues, some First Amendment defenses there. Instead, I think the way the indictment reads is that the special prosecutor absolutely will rely on the idea that the former president tried to incite an insurrection, but that he's in fact charged crimes that relate to doing that in order to, again, try and invalidate the election, which defrauds the U.S. of their honest votes, defrauds the voters of their honest votes, and defrauds the government of their ability to count the votes and their ability to have a free and fair election. In my mind, there's really kind of 2 parts to the indictment. First, it's that the allegations that the former president lied and that he knew he lied, and then the allegations that the former president took very specific actions to try and overturn the election.
And Graham, this indictment also lays out the special prosecutor's belief that Trump did not act alone. We know that there are at least 6 other co-conspirators, allegedly, but they have yet to be charged. Do we know why not? Do we know who they might be and how they might play a role in Trump's case?
We don't know why they're not charged, but they're described as 4 lawyers for former President Trump, a political consultant, and a DOJ, Justice Department official. And they described this series of events where these alleged co-conspirators get together to push officials to ignore the popular vote, and organize fraudulent slates of electors in 7 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So you get kind of the scope of this. And the indictment lays out meeting by meeting where they talked about ways to get the slates of electors in there, talked about meetings they had with officials in different states, talking, in one case, say, an unindicted co-conspirator says, we don't necessarily have the evidence yet, but we have a lot of theories that we're working on. And this kind of goes on for 2 months leading up to January 6th.
And Jessica, you know, one thing that really stood out to me in Jack Smith's remarks was something that both of you touched on. He said he wanted a speedy trial. Clearly that means he believes he has the evidence, right, to do that. What does a speedy trial mean, though? How fast are we talking?
Well, I would say you don't bring this case unless you think you have the evidence. I mean, this is going to be the most scrutinized case potentially in our nation's history. And so a speedy trial really can mean that we're not talking about weeks here, but we could potentially be talking about months. And I know there was a previous conversation about the fact that this case, although it's complicated, it actually could be brought much more quickly than the Mar-a-Lago case, because the Mar-a-Lago case deals with those classified documents. And in that case, we have a relatively new judge who's going to have to figure out a number of really complicated issues dealing with who sees that national security information, whether or not it's presented to the jury. There's a lot of big, thorny questions before you get to trial in the Mar-a-Lago case. And while this case is hugely consequential, I think you could potentially see a very motivated prosecutor and judge say, we're going to do this before the election. I mean, that is absolutely physically possible to do. And of course, I think we know that the former president's best defense is really the electoral calendar. It's not something that would be said in court. It's trying to remain out of court until the election.
Regardless of the timeline, it will be unfolding as campaign 2024 really heats up. Graham Cates and Jessica Levinson, thank you for your time. We are following the latest updates on Donald Trump's indictment over his role in the January 6th Capitol riots. You're streaming America Decides.
If it's important to our nation,
I wonder how you think about where America is at this moment.
It's on Face the Nation.
Can there be stability if Vladimir Putin remains in power?
Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan on CBS.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education.
Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News Streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
I always tell people that Twitter would not be Twitter without Black Twitter. It's just us being in fellowship with each other.
And there becomes a conversation you don't want to be left out of.
People really started to recognize the power of activism on Twitter.
Based on that one tweet, the hashtag #OscarSoWhite was trending around the world.
If anything has really powered Black Twitter, it's been humor.
If your food ain't right, we're going to tell you about that, too.
We tend to create change, create culture and cool.
That's how movements happen on Black Twitter and go beyond more than that.
Black Twitter, the Twitterverse that changed a generation. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
When weather turns extreme,
the threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
CBS News and the Weather Channel bringing virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
Let's bring in our partners at the Weather Channel.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battery lamps.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
Feel the forecast, streaming on CBS News. An original documentary from CBS reports.
The carnage in our nation's schools has become painfully repetitive.
Not one more child
School shootings have parents fighting mad.
I promised my daughter I was going to fight. It's going to keep on happening.
And teachers taking lessons in how to fight back.
This is an exercise.
We approach it as it's you or them.
It shouldn't have to be your teacher's job to protect your life.
But will the battle over gun control,
People are afraid that they're going to lose their gun rights altogether.
be the hardest lesson of all?
The exercise, you're having to shoot at an adult. Are you prepared to have to kill one of your students?
Guns in the Classroom, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's the most successful alpine skier, male or female, ever, and a worldwide inspiration.
We need a lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
Welcome back. As we've been reporting, President Donald Trump has been indicted for his role in the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Hugo Lowe joins us now. He is a political investigations reporter for The Guardian and very sourced up in the Trump world. Hugo, it is great to see you. So obviously, we are already getting emails from the Trump campaign. We're getting statements from the former president. He's already fundraising off of this indictment. Have you spoken to any of your sources about what they think of this?
You know, we've been checking in with people in Trump world in the hours leading up to this indictment. I think a lot of people in Trump's orbit expected it to come last week. And then when it didn't, they had to all kind of rile themselves back up again to turn on the outrage machine so that they could prepare their kind of statements and their kind of media to go out. But I think a lot of the feeling is split down two ways. One is this kind of resignation that Trump was going to be indicted, regardless of what the lawyers said, regardless of the arguments they made. And kind of the problem and the embarrassment of having another federal indictment. And then there's the other channel where the Trump advisors think, you know what, this is just another indictment. We've already had two before. And the fact that, you know, Trump's poll numbers haven't gone down since he's been indicted in the other cases probably bodes well for them, at least going into the Republican convention.
Right. The former president himself has said that he embraces these indictments, and he certainly uses that as a talking point in his campaign. So how do you think that he might try to use this to his benefit, not only in terms of support with voters, but to raise more money?
You know, I think the fundraising is definitely going to be the key thing here. I think even the Trump advisors are aware that there is kind of a Trump fatigue that has started to set in among his MAGA base. And they were certainly projecting that the amount of money they could raise post this indictment would be less than the money that they've been able to raise, for instance, after the New York AG case, which was the first indictment. And so it was kind of novel and very interesting and kind of sparked a lot of outrage among their supporters. And then also with the documents case, because that, again, was so kind of jarring for a lot of his supporters. They think this one and potentially the Fulton County indictment that might come in the weeks ahead, it might not have the same sort of bite. And so they're bracing for a fundraising boost, but maybe not quite as large as what they've had previously.
Hugo, I'm glad you brought up the Fulton County potential indictment there. What seems like might happen in the coming days or weeks with regard to that case?
It's going to come very fast. You know, we've been tracking that case very closely, and our sources in the Fulton County DA's office suggest that when they are done issuing summons to witnesses, it will take about a couple of days to present their case to the regular grand jury. Once that grand jury returns an indictment, then basically it's going to be all about Trump. You know, we expect Trump to be indicted. We expect other co-conspirators to be indicted in that case. And we previously reported that some of the charges include criminal solicitation to commit election fraud and possibly a racketeering charge to go with it. And when that happens, you will see through the month of August, the indictment and then the arraignment, again, of the former president.
And Hugo, I have to let you go quickly, but I want to ask you one more thing, which is there any concern at all that Trump could face prison time?
I don't think so. But that's basically because I think a lot of the Trump advisors have convinced themselves that Trump is going to win, and that once he wins, that he can tell the Department of Justice to drop all the federal cases, and he can work out a deal with the state cases. But that's a big assumption. And if he doesn't win, then I think the prospect of prison time is very, very real for him.
Okay, Hugo Lowe, thank you so much. And now we have Finn Gomez. He is CBS News' political director. Finn, this is another indictment. This is unprecedented. But I wonder whether voters who will decide who the Republican nominee is going to be, whether they think that this is a big deal.
Speaking to voters in Iowa last weekend and speaking to them specifically about this and the potential for this outcome to happen, as I think many of us believed it would, there wasn't the impact that I think some others may believe they would have. It really is. They've rallied around the president. You've seen that now, how even his own rivals, Ron DeSantis, just put out a statement essentially rallying around the president, circling the wagons around the former president, his chief rival. And if you look at the polls, the polling numbers, they say that this is clearly not impacting his trajectory as he heads towards the nomination. There's still a ton of time left. There's just a ton of time in terms of it politically before we get to even to the Iowa caucus is the first early voting contest. But I mean, if you look at the New York Times Siena College poll, it's 54-17 Trump to DeSantis, and everybody else is at 3 points. That just shows where the state of the race is, and that just shows the impact or lack thereof on Trump.
So from where I sit, I cover the White House.
Yeah.
The White House, the Biden campaign, by design, they are staying absolutely mum about this. They don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But I wonder why the other potential GOP nominees are also staying so, shy about slamming the president for all of these charges he faces.
I asked a senior advisor to a rival campaign, to Donald Trump's campaign, and they told me that just isn't worth the risk. They've tested it out themselves. They see that the reaction from your base voter in these early primary states is that they are supportive of the president, and they buy into the argument by the former president and his campaign that this is, quote, a witch hunt, that this is a politically motivated, and you hear that. You even hear from Mike Pence, who's listed in this indictment. It's surprising to some, but again, if you go and listen to these voters and talk to them directly, it just doesn't impact them.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Mike Pence, because in this indictment,
Right.
He is all over it. And he seems to be a key witness who took extremely close notes about his interactions with President Trump. But how do you think the fact that he is also running for president against Trump might complicate the indictment as well as his own campaign?
It's unprecedented, Weege. I mean, it really is. I mean, he is listed here. He's writing, Jack Smith, in this report, it talks about his contemporaneous notes that he took in these discussions with the former president. And at one point, when he pushed back against then President Trump about trying to overturn the election, he essentially says, Trump told Pence, "You're too honest." Like, can you imagine that? Like, and if they both end up on the debate stage in a couple weeks, on August 23rd in Wisconsin, like, how is that interaction going to be? I mean, this is such an unprecedented place that we are in modern American political history.
And that is a reality that could very much happen. So we will be watching. Yeah. Thank you, Finn. We'll have more on Trump's historic third indictment next. You're streaming America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him as Anthony DeVolder from Queens.
Really, who he is, he's a fraud.
I compare him to the Tinder swindler.
From people who know him, the truth, the facts, the lies.
He would say that he was worth $100 million.
It's an incredibly cynical episode in American politics, beyond satire.
Had you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I hope I never see it again.
Campaign of Deceit, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She dazzled on the court and off the court as a businesswoman. Thank you for joining us on Person to Person. Tennis superstar and entrepreneur, Serena Williams.
an original CBS Reports documentary.
I asked my students, what are we going to do about racism in the United States?
The backlash over teaching about racism in American schools.
I don't think it has any place in the classroom.
We can either pretend and say, no, we're not racist and we're all great people, or we can actually start to do the really, really hard work of addressing it.
How did you lose your job?
I made the statement that white privilege is a fact.
Is it helping diversity and inclusion?
When you bring in different people's stories and experience, it enriches education.
If you don't talk about something, it doesn't go away.
Or driving us further apart?
What schools are doing to our children in the name of anti-racism is in fact teaching them racism.
The intention is to put us in this war against each other.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
I was entitled to equal pay for equal work under the law.
Does the Supreme Court's power need to be checked?
9 Supreme Court justices, 5 of them said no, she's not entitled. That's not right.
Calls to fix the court tend to go along with the politics of the moment.
Republican-appointed justices have all tended to go in one direction, with the Democratic-appointed justices tending to go in another.
Even though it's only 9 justices, it takes 5 of them to make the law of the land.
Does it have political impact? True. Political intent? Probably not true.
If the American people don't trust the judgment of their court, that's a real problem for our democracy.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my 2 good friends, and we talk about the world.
What are the words you would use to describe the Queen?
Kind, caring, and a nice lady.
I'm here for you.
America needs drivers.
And we're here to help.
What are you learning from Girls on the Run?
Never give up and to always keep trying.
You can see fire and rescue is up.
They're doing wellness checks when people are trapped inside their homes.
We're gonna be okay. We're gonna make it.
We are following the latest developments in our top story of the evening, the indictment of Donald Trump over his role in the January 6th insurrection. CBS News' senior political analyst, John Dickerson, joins us now. John, I know that you have been studying this 45-page indictment all afternoon. The special counsel did not touch the potential insurrection charges, but he seemed very confident about these 4 felony counts that really focus on the former president's attempt to overturn a legitimate election.
The picture that the special counsel paints of the former president is someone who on the election basically engages in what the special counsel calls a criminal scheme and directs that scheme in a number of different avenues, keeps trying each one, and then when they fail, he goes on to the next one. And so he makes inroads at the Justice Department. He makes inroads in the individual states. He pressures his vice president, Mike Pence. And then, of course, he supports, as a part of pressuring the vice president, he supports this idea of fake electors, or alternative electors, as the president would have called them, all the while knowing that the claims underlying his scheme were lies, and he knew them to be lies. And yet, nevertheless, he pursued all of these avenues, and then, of course, including calling his supporters to Washington to stop the steal.
And I'm glad you brought up the former vice president, because he is all over this indictment and appears to be such a key witness, but he is also running for president against Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election. How do you think that will complicate, this case moving forward, as well as Pence's campaign?
Well, it would be more complicated in terms of the case if former Vice President Pence was doing better in the campaign. In other words, if he were doing better, perhaps former President Trump could write off any testimony by him as something to try and get Trump out of the race. But Mike Pence is not doing very well in the Republican race. He may not even make the debate stage, which requires a certain level of success within his party. Part of that reason is because his former boss has painted him as a turncoat, completely upending the normal way in which Republicans used to talk about honor in a presidential race. They used to say, who can stand up and do the right thing at the tough moment? That defines what Mike Pence did, and he's paying the penalty for it politically.
And I also wonder about, actually, John, we're out of time.
Oh,
and
I'm
you will
familiar
take
with
it
that.
from
We
here.
should.
So thank you very much, John.
Sure thing.
That does it for today. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You can watch Prime Time with John Dickerson at 7 p.m. Eastern and Pacific. You're streaming CBS News.
It's a history-making meeting. 4 extraordinary women who are all 4-star generals and admirals.
How did you deal with being discriminated against? I just worked harder.
The future of an ever-evolving U.S. military when we go person to person.
Stories start with the who, what, when, and where.
CBS News has been following this story. Camilla, why is the government relying on these devices to track migrants?
But it's why it's important to you that matters most. Doctor, why are federal health advisors focusing on this specific pill for contraception? And knowing what to ask is how you open the door to a deeper understanding. I'm John Dickerson. See you on Prime Time. Streaming free everywhere.
Stories that inform.
You can be really